Alright, so doing a preview of Floyd Mayweather versus Conor McGregor. I'm gonna do basically a preview of the entire pay-per-view card. Um, Main event: Floyd Mayweather versus McGregor. I mean, if you've heard me talk about this on podcasts and what have you, you know pretty much what I think about it. You know, it's pretty much whatever Mayweather wants to happen is gonna happen. If he wants to knock out McGregor fast, he's gonna do it fast. If he wants to take him a few rounds, clown him, and then finally destroy him in the seventh or eighth round or something of that nature, that's what he's gonna do. You know, if he wants him to go the distance, he's gonna go the distance. If Floyd Mayweather loses this fight, it's because he wanted to lose the fight. You know, I guess he's sold out and managed to make those tax problems go away and got a nice hefty payoff for his troubles to not break that quote unquote record of Rocky Marciano's and things of that nature. But basically whatever Floyd wants to happen is going to happen in the fight. I wouldn't even be surprised if he knocked McGregor out on accident. McGregor isn't exactly the best enduring fighter around. He's not exactly like a stamina workhorse necessarily. So I could very easily see him being gassed out by the mid rounds, and at that point, when you're that tired, punches that aren't even necessarily like the biggest, most bombastic shots on the planet can do a pretty critical amount of damage, or at the very least knock you off balance to such a degree that you're not able to maintain equilibrium, and the ref ends up stopping it and stuff like that. But that's pretty much the main event in a nutshell. Badu Jack versus Nathan Cleverly is a fight that I'm definitely very interested in. Badu Jack, the former best fighter at super middleweight, he's moved up. This is going to be his debut at light heavyweight. And in Nathan Cleverly, he's at the very least fighting a guy that's basically, a top 10 level light heavyweight. This is for the regular WBA title, basically meaning that the winner of this fight becomes the mandatory for Andre Ward. Cleverly already kind of effectively is, and then if Jack defeats him, of course, which I think that he will, he'll wind up becoming the eventual mandatory for Andre Ward. Although promotional situations as they happen to be may potentially prevent that fight from actually happening. I mean, considering the fact that Ward is with Rock Nation, and then the possibility that he may even be moving to the top rank may actually even complicate matters further, considering all that. But Jack versus Cleverly, I think, is a pretty good fight. I think Cleverly, he's a scrappy fighter. He's not on the level of Jack, I don't think necessarily, but he's tough. He's a tough guy. He's a gritty guy. I could very well see him giving some really solid rounds to Jack. I could see a few pretty good, maybe swing rounds even. But overall, I think Jack, his skills will kind of be the name of the game in this fight, and it'll allow him to basically just be up by at least a round or two the entire way through, and he'll probably get a pretty clear-cut decision over Cleverly. If not a potential late stoppage, but Jack isn't necessarily like a finisher. He's not a guy that really jumps on you and takes you out right then and there as soon as you're kind of ready to be taken out. Interestingly enough, the next fight, though, Gervonta Davis was originally supposed to be fighting Roman Martinez, but I actually think they in a way somewhat may have upgraded his opponent when they wound up bringing in Francisco Fonseca, a guy that's 19-0-1 with 13 knockouts. Bit of an unknown considering the fact that most of his fights have been in Costa Rica. He's a fighter from Costa Rica, so it makes a certain degree of sense. He's a young guy, though, 23, and he's undefeated. So at the very least, we're getting some new blood here. It's not just Davis fighting the leftovers from yesteryear's super featherweight division. A guy that's been beaten multiple times, and most recently by a vicious knockout from Vasyl Lomachenko. So I don't think that would have looked all that great for Davis, pretty much regardless of what he did, even if he knocked him out early or earlier or quicker than Lomachenko did. I mean, at that point, it's almost like you would expect him to if you're expecting Davis to be a top-level super featherweight in his own right. But here, at the very least, we have some new blood, and Fonseca seems to kind of style himself as a bit of a puncher. He's managed to score a lot of knockouts in the number of wins that he has. Some reasonably early knockouts too, but over relatively middling composition in comparison to even the guys that Davis has faced. Even the guys that Davis has faced recently. But we'll see. Sometimes these unknown fighters can be a lot tougher than some people may expect them to be. Like, if you think back to like Diego Chavez or even Marcos Maidana back when he first kind of emerged and kind of took out Ortiz and then took Amir Khan to the brink, for instance. You never know when guys like that, or what was his name? Ricardo Torres, the guy that fought Miguel Cotto, gave him, I think, Cotto probably the best fight of Cotto's career, like just the best fight to watch, like for watching's sake. Cotto had to fight through a lot of adversity in order to win that fight. He's another guy, a guy from Colombia, however, that just kind of came out of nowhere, was a late replacement, and just turned out to be a fantastic fight, and was himself a pretty solid champion the next couple of years although it seemed like after he got knocked out by a head clash against Kendall Holt, his career was pretty much derailed at that point forward. Of course, it seems like the fight that's going to be rounding out the pay-per-view, Thomas Delorme versus Yordenis Ugas. Delorme was originally supposed to be fighting against Sean Porter, and in that fight I really favored Porter to win. I thought he'd be able to just kind of bully and bust up Delorme. I mean, Delorme had a reasonable puncher's chance. He's a pretty big puncher, and once he's able to kind of get extension on those shots, he can be fairly dangerous. But Porter to me is a guy that's just strong enough, gritty enough, and has a good enough set of whiskers. He's got pretty good punch resistance for what it's worth, even though his balance is a bit iffy. That I think that he would have been able to get through any troublesome moments that Delorme would have provided for him. But that fight does not happen. It's going to be Delorme versus Ugas. Ugas is an interesting one. Guy that's a former Cuban national amateur fighter for the national team and everything. Of course, he defected to the U.S. And he's had this kind of an up and down career. Has a few losses on his record. Most recently against Amir Imam, who of course at the time was surging up until he lost to Adrian Granados. But after the Imam fight, he actually kind of recovered with two really, really key wins. He defeated two undefeated prospects. The first one was Jamal James, who was 20-0 going into that fight, and the second one was Bryant Perella, who was 14-0 going into that fight. He defeated James by a clear unanimous decision, where he hurt James multiple times in that fight. Was able to kind of take James's height and reach advantages away from him, and pretty much just busted up Perella. I mean, he was just able to kind of sharpshoot him and beat him up. This is a reasonably competitive fight between these two, I'd say. I do give the edge to Delorme. I think that just he's a little bit quicker on that first step. Just a little bit quicker with those first couple of shots. Just a slightly quicker hand, slightly quicker feet, and I think he'll be able to maintain distance a bit better than Ugas. But Delorme has shown himself to be a bit on the chinny side in the past. Although his two losses were to fairly bona fide punchers in Crawford and Abregu, but that is something that Ugas is not. He's not a straight out bona fide puncher. He's a guy that's a bit more of a boxer. A lot more of like a technician, a stylist. A guy that wasn't necessarily like a standout even in the Cuban team. So he doesn't necessarily have like those especially like otherworldly talents like you might see from like a Gamboa or a Rigondeaux, or some of the guys that were like really the true standouts from the Cuban amateur systems, things of that nature. But that's pretty much going to do it for the roundup of the pay-per-view portion of the card, as I think that is going to wind up turning out to be. There's a few other fights on the undercard as well that I believe will be either streamed or televised, and maybe possibly on Showtime or Fox or something. I'll try to see if I can get the details of that. But Andrew Tabiti versus Steve Cunningham is actually a pretty interesting fight. Tabiti is a money team fighter, one of Floyd Mayweather's promoted fighters, fighting against Steve Cunningham, former cruiserweight champion, a guy that's definitely one of the recent greats of the cruiserweight division. And Tabiti is a guy that's kind of been surging. So this is his chance to kind of come up and shine, basically. Tabiti's a big puncher. And so really he should be able to knock Steve Cunningham out. Cunningham, not unlike Delorme, incidentally, is a bit of a chinny guy. And Tabiti, being as big of a puncher as he is, at some point he should be able to get a bead on Cunningham and be able to take him out. That's just kind of the way I see it. I do think Tabiti is the goods, and I think that he should be able to handle his business against Steve Cunningham. Also on the non-pay-per-view portion of the undercard, a couple of undefeated fighters at welterweight. Juan Heraldez versus Jose Miguel Borrego. Really good fight between these two, actually. Actually, might be a bit of maybe a show stealer for the deeper undercard portion of this overall card. Geraldes 12-0 with 8 knockouts, and Borrego is 13-0 with 12 knockouts. I mean, two definite punchers, especially in Borrego's case. I think it might be a pretty interesting fight to be had. Borrego's only 19 years old. Geraldes is much older, 27. I'm pretty sure Geraldes is another money team fighter. So if anything, he's probably going to be the one really favored to win this fight. I'd imagine that they matched him up. Or they tried to match him up somewhat favorably, although, fighting a guy with a 92% knockout ratio is a pretty dangerous game to be playing, regardless of, who he's knocking out. I mean, if a guy that has that many knockouts and that amount of wins, you got to imagine that he's punching reasonably hard, and several of those wins were against guys with pretty solid winning records, so I wouldn't say that that punching power is anything to be trifled with necessarily. And then you got Savannah Marshall versus Sydney LeBlanc. Savannah Marshall, one of the amateur female boxing standouts from the UK. She's actually, interestingly enough, the only woman to have ever defeated Claressa Shields in amateurs. Shields did manage to avenge that loss, I think, at least once, if not twice. Not entirely sure on the details there, but she's making her pro debut against Sydney LeBlanc. I'm sure that Marshall feels like, hey, she might be able to get some nice money fights against Shields at some point in the future. Sydney LeBlanc, interestingly enough, has already fought Shields. She actually fought Claressa in Claressa's third fight, then wound up losing to Franchon Cruz, who was actually the woman that Shields fought in her pro debut. So of course you're gonna get some familiar names in the records of these females, considering the fact that, especially at the higher weights, middleweight around, and welterweight and up, basically, the talent pool isn't especially deep. So you'll see some familiar names frequently when it comes to the televised female championship and or contender level fighters. And then rounding out the card, Kevin Newman II versus Mark Anthony Hernandez. Hernandez 9-1, and Newman is 7-0-1. Kind of a fight. Two kind of up and comers, basically, trying to do their thing on a big undercard. And hey, you never know. One of these two guys may, at some point in the future, become somebody that's actually a headliner in their own right. So that's going to do it for my preview of Mayweather versus McGregor. I'll just restate, Mayweather wins by whatever fashion he deems fit to win by. The other fights are reasonably interesting. Davis Fonseca is a bit of a wild card. Jack, I think, beats Cleverly in a reasonably entertaining fight. Delorme and Ugas, I think, is a pretty well-matched fight, but I favor Delorme there. Tabiti I favor over Cunningham. I think you should knock him out. Geraldes and Borrego is another bit of a wild card. Borrego's punching power is a bit of a scary thing to be tossed in there against, regardless of his general inexperience, from being a young guy. Savannah Marshall, potential future opponent for Claressa Shields. And Kevin Newman versus Mark Anthony Hernandez just rounds it out. So some pretty good records overall on the card, on the line, and it'll be good trying to think, exposure for a lot of these fighters. If some of them may manage to pull off some show-stopping stuff, not unlike Joran Nakaz a couple months ago on the Manny Pacquiao undercard. You never know when some of these guys may emerge. And hey, even Manny Pacquiao himself, of course, was on kind of had his breakout moment on Lewis versus Tyson when he fought Lelo Laduaba. So, it's definitely nothing to be trifled with. So that's going to do it for this one. I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace.